Part 5, Historical Materialism. Section 1, The Motor Forces of History. As soon as the question, where do our ideas come from, is raised, the need for pursuing our research further becomes apparent. If we reasoned in the manner of the 18th century materialists, who thought that the mind secretes thought as the liver secretes bile, we could answer this question by saying that it is nature that produces the mind and that, consequently, our ideas are the product of nature and the product of our minds. It could then be said that history is made by the action of men driven by their will, the latter being the expression of their ideas, which are themselves derived from their brains. But watch out! An error to avoid. If we explain the French Revolution by saying that it was the result of the application of the ideas that arose in the minds of philosophers, this would be a narrow and insufficient explanation, and a poor application of materialism. What must be seen is why the ideas launched by the thinkers of this period were adopted by the masses. Why was Diderot not alone in conceiving of them? And for what reason were the great majority of minds since the 16th century developing the same ideas? Is it because these minds suddenly had the same weight, the same convolution? No, there were changes in ideas, but no change took place inside the skull. This explanation of ideas by the brain seems like a materialist explanation, but to speak of Diderot's brain is really to speak of the ideas in Diderot's brain. Hence, this is a falsified and improper materialist theory in which we witness the revival of the idealist tendency to give primary importance to ideas. Let us go back to the sequence: history, action, will, ideas. Ideas have a meaning, a content. The working class, for example, struggles for the elimination of capitalism. This is an idea held by the struggling workers. They think because they have brains, certainly. And the brain is therefore a necessary condition for thinking, but it is not a sufficient condition. The brain explains the material act of having ideas, but it does not explain why one has certain ideas rather than others. Everything which sets men in motion must go through their minds, but what form it will take in the mind will depend very much upon the circumstances. How can we then explain the content of our ideas? That is, how does the idea of overthrowing capitalism come to us? Social being and consciousness. We know that our ideas are the reflection of things. The goals that our ideas contain are also the reflection of things. But which things? In order to answer this question, we must see where men live and where their ideas appear. We find that men live in a capitalist society and that their ideas appear in the society and are derived from it. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. In this definition, what Marx calls their being signifies what we are. Consciousness is what we think, what we desire. We are struggling for an ideal profoundly rooted in us. It is generally said, and as a result of this, it is our consciousness that determines our being. We act in a certain way because we think in a certain way, because we want to. It is a grave error to speak this way, for in reality, it is our social being that determines our consciousness. A proletarian thinks like a proletarian, and a bourgeois thinks like a bourgeois. We shall see later why this is not always the case. But, generally speaking, a man thinks differently in a palace and in a hut. Idealist theories. Idealists say that a proletarian or a bourgeois is one or the other because he thinks like one or the other. We say, on the contrary, that while one may think like a proletarian or a bourgeois, this is because one is one or the other. A proletarian has a proletarian class consciousness because he is a proletarian. We should pay close attention to the practical consequences of this idealist theory. Accordingly, if one is a bourgeois, it is because one thinks like a bourgeois. Hence, in order to stop being one, it is sufficient to change the way of thinking in question. In order to halt bourgeois exploitation, it is sufficient to make the bosses change their convictions. This is a theory defended by Christian socialists. It was also shared by the founders of utopian socialism. Moreover, it is also held by the fascists who fight against capitalism, not to eliminate it, but to make it more, quote, rational. As soon as management understands that it exploits workers, they say it will no longer do so. Here we have a completely idealist theory whose dangers are obvious to us. Social being and the conditions of existence. Marx speaks of social being. What does he mean by this? Social being is determined by the material conditions of existence in which men live in society. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their material conditions of existence, but these material conditions that determine their consciousness. What are the material conditions of existence? In society, there are rich people and poor people, and their way of thinking is different. Their ideas on the same subject are different. Taking the subway for someone poor and unemployed is a luxury, but it is a disgrace for someone rich who has a car. Does a poor person entertain these ideas about the subway because he is poor or because he takes the subway? Because he is poor. Being poor is his condition of existence. So we must see why there are rich people and poor people in order to be able to explain men's conditions of existence. In the economic process of production, a group of people occupying an analogous place, i.e. in the present capitalist system, possessing the means of production, or on the contrary, working on the means of production that do not belong to them, and consequently having to a certain extent the same material conditions of existence, form a class. However, the notion of class is not simply that of wealth or poverty. A proletarian may earn more than a bourgeois. He is nonetheless a proletarian because he is dependent on a boss and because his life is neither secure nor independent. The material conditions of existence consist not only of money earned but also of social function. Therefore, we have the following sequence. People make their history through their actions according to their will, which is the expression of their ideas. The latter are derived from their material conditions of existence, i.e., their membership in a class. Class struggle, the motor of history. People act because they have certain ideas. They owe these ideas to their material conditions of existence because they belong to one class or another. This does not mean that there are only two classes in society. There are a number of classes, of which two are principally in conflict, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Hence, beneath ideas, there are classes. Society is divided into classes that struggle against each other. Thus, if we examine the ideas that man has, we see that these ideas are in conflict, and that beneath these ideas, we find classes that are themselves in conflict as well. Consequently, the motor forces of history, i.e., the explanation of history, is class struggle. If we take the permanent deficit of the budget, for example, we see that there are two solutions. One consists of continuing what is called financial orthodoxy, savings, loans, new taxes, etc. The other solution consists of making the rich pay. We observe a political struggle around these ideas. Generally, one is sorry that one cannot reach an agreement on this matter. The Marxist, however, wants to understand and looks for what is underneath the political struggle. He then discovers the social struggle, i.e., class struggle. Struggle between those who favor the first solution, capitalists, and those who favor making the rich pay, middle classes and proletariat. Engels says, quote, "In modern history, at least, it is therefore proved that all political struggles are class struggles, and all class struggles for emancipation in the last resort, despite their necessarily political form, for every class struggle is a political struggle, turn ultimately on the question of economic emancipation." End quote. Thus, we have another link to add to the sequence we have used to explain history. We now have action, will, ideas, beneath which are found classes, and behind classes is the economy. Hence, it is indeed class struggles that explain history, but it is the economy that determines classes. If we wish to explain a historical fact, we must examine which ideas are in conflict, look for the classes beneath these ideas, and finally, define the economic mode which characterizes these classes. One may still wonder where classes and the economic mode come from, and dialecticians are not afraid of asking all these successive questions because they know that we must find the source of everything. This is what we shall study in detail in the next chapter, but we can already say, in order to know where classes come from, one must study the history of society, and then one will see that the existing classes have not always been the same. In Greece, slaves and masters. In the Middle Ages, serfs and lords. Next, to simplify the enumeration, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In the above description, we find that classes change, and if we look for the reason why they change, we shall see that it is because the economic conditions have changed. By economic conditions, we mean the structure of production, of distribution, of exchange, of the consumption of goods, and as the ultimate condition of all the rest, the way of producing or technology. Here follows a text by Engels, quote, "Bourgeoisie and proletariat both arose in consequence of a transformation of the economic conditions, more precisely of the mode of production. The transition first from guild handicrafts to manufacture, and then from manufacture to large-scale industry, with steam and mechanical power, had caused the development of these two classes." End quote. Hence, in the last analysis, we see that we may represent the motor forces of history by the following sequence. A. History is the work of men. B. Action which creates history is determined by their will. C. This will is the expression of their ideas. D. These ideas are the reflection of the social conditions in which they live. E. It is these social conditions which determine classes and their struggles. F. Classes are themselves determined by economic conditions. To clarify in what forms and under what conditions this sequence takes place, let us say that 1. Ideas find their expression in life in the political sphere. 2. Class struggles, which are behind the struggles of ideas, are manifested in the social sphere. 3. Economic conditions, which are determined by the state of technology, find their expression in the economic sphere. Section 2. Where do classes and economic conditions come from? We have seen that in the last analysis, the motor forces of history are classes, and their struggles determined by economic conditions. This may be expressed by the following sequence. People have ideas in their heads which make them act. These ideas are derived from the material conditions of existence in which they live. These material conditions of existence are determined by the social place they occupy in society, i.e., by the class to which they belong, and classes are themselves determined by the economic conditions in which society evolves. But it remains for us to see what it is that determines economic conditions and the classes they create. This is what we propose to study below. The first great division of labor. By studying the evolution of society and taking into account the events of the past, the first observation one makes is that the division of society into classes has not always existed. Dialectics demands that we search for the origin of things. Now, we find that in a far distant past, there were no classes. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels tells us, quote, "Production at all former stages of society was essentially collective. There was not one class, one category, then another. Likewise, consumption of the products created by men was collective. This is primitive communism. All men participate in production. The individual instruments of labor are private property, but those which are used in common belong to the community. The division of labor exists at this lower stage only between the sexes. Man hunts, fishes, etc. Woman takes care of the house. There are no private interests at stake, but men did not remain in this period. The first change in the life of men will be the division of labor in society. But the division of labor slowly insinuates itself into this process of production." End quote. This first event occurs when men, quote, "found animals which could be tamed, and when once tamed, bred. The wild buffalo cow had to be hunted. The tame buffalo cow gave a calf yearly and milk as well. A number of the most advanced tribes, the Aryans, Semites, perhaps already also the Turanians, now made their chief work first the taming of cattle, later their breeding and tending only. Pastoral tribes separated themselves from the mass of the rest of the barbarians. The first great social division of labor. End quote. Here we have as the first mode of production hunting and fishing, as the second mode of production cattle raising, which gives rise to pastoral tribes. This first division of labor is the basis for the first division of society into classes. Quote, the increase of production in all branches, cattle raising, agriculture, domestic handicrafts, gave human labor power the capacity to produce a larger product than was necessary for its maintenance. At the same time, it increased the daily amount of work to be done by each member of the gens, household community, or single family. It was now desirable to bring in new labor forces. War provided them. Prisoners of war were turned into slaves. With its increase of the production of labor and therefore of wealth, and its extension of the field of production, the first great social division of labor was bound, in the great historical conditions prevailing, to bring slavery in its train. From the first great social division of labor arose the first great cleavage of society into two classes, masters and slaves, exploiters and exploited. We have now reached the threshold of civilization. Civilization opens with a new advance in the division of labor. At the lowest stage of barbarism, men produced only directly for their own needs. Any acts of exchange were isolated occurrences, the object of exchange merely some fortuitous surplus. In the middle stage of barbarism, we already find among the pastoral peoples a possession in the form of cattle which, once the herd has attained a certain size, regularly produces a surplus over and above the tribe's own requirements, leading to a division of labor between pastoral peoples and backward tribes without herds, and hence to the exchange of two different levels of production side by side with one another, and to the conditions necessary for regular exchange. End quote. Thus, at this moment, we have two classes in society, masters and slaves. Thereafter, society will continue to live and to undergo new developments. A new class will appear and grow. The second great division of labor. Quote, wealth increased rapidly, but as the wealth of individuals. The products of weaving, metalwork, and the other handicrafts, which were becoming more and more differentiated, displayed growing variety and skill. In addition to corn, leguminous plants and fruits, agriculture now provided wine and oil, and the preparation of which had been learned. Such manifold activities were no longer within the scope of one and the same individual. The second great division of labor took place. Handicraft separated from agriculture. The continuous increase of production and simultaneously of the productivity of labor heightened the value of human labor power. Slavery now becomes an essential constituent part of the social system. Slaves are driven by dozens to work in the fields and the workshops. With the splitting up of production into the two great main branches, agriculture and handicrafts, arises production directly for exchange, commodity production. With it came commerce. End quote. The second division of society into classes. In this way, the first great division of labor increases the value of human labor and creates a growth of wealth, which again increases the value of labor and makes a second division of labor necessary, handicrafts and agriculture. At this moment, the constant increase of production and with it of the value of the human labor power makes slaves indispensable and creates commercial production, and with it a third class, merchants. Hence, at this moment in society, we have a triple division of labor and three classes, farmers, artisans, merchants. For the first time, we see a class appear which does not participate in production, and this class, the merchant class, will dominate the other two. Quote, the upper stage of barbarism brings us the further division of labor between agriculture and handicrafts. Hence, the production of a constantly increasing portion of the products of labor directly for exchange, so that exchange between individual producers assumes the importance of a vital social function. Civilization consolidates and intensifies all these existing divisions of labor, particularly by sharpening the opposition between town and country. The town may economically dominate the country, as in antiquity, or the country the town, as in the Middle Ages. and it adds a third division of labor, peculiar to itself and of decisive importance. It creates a class which no longer concerns itself with production, but only with the exchange of products, the merchants. This class makes itself into an indispensable middleman between any two producers and exploits them both. Under the pretext of becoming the most useful class of the population, a class of parasites, who, as a reward for their actually very insignificant services, skim all the cream off production at home and abroad, rapidly amass enormous wealth and a corresponding social influence, and for that reason receive, under civilization, ever higher honors and ever greater control of production until at last they also bring forth a product of their own, the periodical commercial crises." End quote. Hence, we see the sequence which, beginning with primitive communism, leads to capitalism. 1. Primitive communism. 2. Division between barbarians and pastoral tribes. First division of labor, master and slaves. 3. Division between farmers and artisans. Second division of labor. 4. Birth of a merchant class. Third division of labor, which 5. Engenders periodic commercial crises, capitalism. Now we know where classes come from. It remains for us to study what determines economic conditions. We should first review very briefly the different societies that have preceded us. We lack documents with which to study in detail the history of societies that preceded those of antiquity. But we know, for example, that with the Greeks, masters and slaves existed and that the merchant class was already beginning to develop. Then, in the Middle Ages, feudal society with its lords and serfs enabled the merchants to gain more and more importance. They clustered near the castles in the heart of the bourgs, whence the name bourgeois. Moreover, in the Middle Ages, before capitalist production, there were only small enterprises whose primary condition was that the producer be the owner of his instruments of labor. The means of production belonged to the individual and were adapted only to individual use. Consequently, they were paltry, small, and limited. The historical role of capitalist production and the bourgeoisie was to concentrate and enlarge these means of production, transforming them into the powerful levers of modern production. Quote, "Since the 15th century, this has been historically worked out through the three phases of simple cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry. But the bourgeoisie, as is also shown there, could not transform these limited means of production into mighty productive forces without transforming them, at the same time, from means of production of the individual into social means of production only workable by a collectivity of men." End quote. Hence, we see that, parallel with the evolution of classes, masters and slaves, lords and serfs, there is an evolution of the conditions of production, of distribution, and of exchange of wealth, i.e. of economic conditions, and that this economic evolution follows step by step and coincides with the evolution of the modes of production. It is therefore the modes of production. That is, the condition of instruments and tools, their utilization, labor methods, in a word, the state of technology, which determines economic conditions. Quote, "The spinning wheel, the hand loom, the blacksmith's hammer were replaced by the spinning machine, the power loom, the steam hammer, the individual workshop by the factory, implying the cooperation of hundreds of thousands of workmen. In like manner, production itself changed from a series of individual into a series of social acts, and the products from individual to social products." End quote. Here we see that the evolution of modes of production totally transformed the productive forces. Now, while the tools of labor have become collective, the ownership of property has remained individual. Machines which can function only through collective implementation have remained the property of a single man. For this reason, we see that, quote, "the productive forces press forward to the practical recognition of their character as social productive forces. They command the socialization of great masses of means of production, which we meet with in the different kinds of joint stock companies. This form also becomes inefficient. The official representative of capitalist society, the state, will ultimately have to undertake the direction of production. This shows how unnecessary the bourgeoisie are for that purpose. all the social functions of the capitalist are now performed by salaried employees. End quote. Thus, the contradictions of the capitalist system become clear to us. Quote, on the one hand, perfecting of machinery made by competition compulsory for each individual manufacturer and complemented by a constantly growing displacement of laborers. On the other hand, unlimited expansion of production, also compulsory under competition for every manufacturer. On both sides, unheard of development of productive forces, excess of supply over demand, overproduction, gutting of the markets, crises every 10 years, the vicious cycle, excess here of means of production and products, excess there of laborers without employment and without means of existence. End quote. There is a contradiction between work, which has become social and collective, and property, which has remained private. And so, with Marx, we shall say, quote, from the forms of development of productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins a period of social revolution. End quote. Comments. Before ending this chapter, we must make a few comments and underline the fact that, in this study, we find all the characteristics and laws of dialectics that we have just studied. Indeed, we have just very quickly traced the history of societies, of classes, and of modes of production. We see how dependent each part of this study is on the other. We find that this history is essentially in motion, and that the changes that occur at each stage of the evolution of society are provoked by an internal struggle between the different conservative and progressive elements, a struggle that ends in the destruction of one society and in the birth of a new one. Each society has a character and a structure quite different from the society that preceded it. These radical transformations occur after an accumulation of events which, in themselves, seem insignificant, but which, at a certain moment, create by their accumulation a situation which provokes an abrupt revolutionary change. Hence, here we recognize the characteristics and the great general laws of dialectics, namely, the interdependence of things and events, dialectical motion and change, autodynamism, contradiction, reciprocal action, and evolution by leaps, transformation of quantity into quality. End of part 5.